Plato's Republic is the single most influential work of philosophy in the entire Western tradition. It's a foundational text for Western ethics, aesthetics, psychology, theory of education, theory of knowledge, aka epistemology, and of course, political theory. And it wasn't just a banger in its own day. It has continued to influence the world throughout the 2,400 years that it has existed. It had a deep impact on the theologies of all three Abrahamic faiths, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. It influenced secular thinkers from the Renaissance and scientific revolution through the Enlightenment and up to the present. Its themes and allegories continue to inspire books and movies today, including Lord of the Rings, The Matrix, and Snowpiercer, just to name a few. And the major questions that the Republic asks about justice, happiness, and democracy are still hotly debated even now. In short, you simply cannot understand the history of Western thought, and even a lot of our current ethical and political debates, without having at least some familiarity with this book. And yet, for many people, this book seems daunting, intimidating. But that's unfortunate, because it's a stupendously fascinating, and I'd even say fun read. It's just that if you open it up without any prior knowledge of ancient Greek history or philosophy, you might find yourself very confused very fast. So what the world needs now, I think, is an accessible primer on this work, a quick but full summary of what it says and why it's important. And that's what we're going to do today. Hi, thanks for tuning in to Ancient Greece Declassified. If you're new to the show, I'm Lantern Jack. I have a PhD in ancient philosophy, and I admit I'm somewhat obsessed with this book. The first time I read it, I did not like it, but each time I reread it, I liked it more and more, and I discovered new layers of meaning and wisdom that I had missed the previous times around. But here's what really blew my mind about this book. I think it was maybe the fourth time I was revisiting it, and at the time I was thinking about how drastically our society had changed over the past 2 decades, with the rise of polarization, extreme economic inequality, demagoguery, dishonest media, divisive politics, record levels of personal debt. And I suddenly realized that all of these problems are at the heart of this book, because all of those things happened to Athens in Plato's day. When I realized that, I was like, oh my God, we've been here before. But nobody talks about that, which is crazy, because meanwhile, we seem to be repeating a lot of the same mistakes that the world's first democratic superpower made, while acting like none of this has ever happened before. We are navigating uncharted waters. Anyway, that's what inspired me several years ago to launch a multi-episode exploration of Plato's Republic on my podcast, Ancient Greece Declassified. And I was able to get many of the world's foremost Plato scholars as guests on that program. If you're watching this on YouTube, you can find all that by searching for Ancient Greece Declassified on any podcast app. And if I ever make videos out of those episodes, which I should, I'll drop links in the description below. So that series is something I'm very proud of. I think it's going to be the most comprehensive, accessible, free, academically rigorous, while also entertaining guide to this foundational work, showcasing a plurality of scholars and interpretations. But it's not for everybody. It's a big commitment to go through all that. It's 14 episodes and counting. And what I realized is still missing, what people have asked me for, is what I said earlier, a full summary and explanation of this work in just one episode. Now, I have ransacked YouTube in search of such a summary, but have not found one that does justice to this work. So that's what I'm going to attempt today, but I'm not going to do it alone. For this Herculean task, I have enlisted the help of a distinguished scholar of ancient philosophy. Gina White is Assistant Professor of Classics at the University of Kansas. She has a deep knowledge not just of the Republic itself, but of its influence on later thinkers from Aristotle to Cicero and beyond. Gina White, welcome to Ancient Greece Declassified.
Thank you so much for having me, Jack. I am so excited and also intimidated by the task we've set ourselves today.
Well, see, you've undoubtedly studied this book in the original ancient Greek many times through university, graduate school, and now as an academic scholar. Are you sick of it yet?
Absolutely not. Unfortunately, as all my students know, I will invariably set a bit of the Republic no matter what topic we're studying, because it just speaks to so many issues in the ancient and the contemporary world. It's infuriating, it's huge, it's complex. Every time I read it, I find something else. And every time I read it, I realize I misunderstood something that I thought I had a handle on. So it's the kind of text which just repays revisiting. And I've been studying it for 20 years. I've not got sick of it yet.
I can relate to that. So what's our plan for today?
Our plan for today is to go through the 10 books of the Republic. When we say books, we're talking about the way that the text was divided originally into papyrus scrolls. So it's one continuous Platonic dialogue, but is kind of, for ease of convenience, divided up into shorter chunks. We're going to be, each of us, taking one of those books, trying to summarize it in 2 minutes, and then having a 2-minute chat to kind of clarify anything that was missed, add anything, challenge each other maybe if we have any disagreement in interpretation. So I think the way that we'd planned to do it was, one, you take the odd number books, so start at book 1, and I take the even, starting at book 2. Does that sound right?
That sounds great. Difficult, but I'm as excited as I am nervous about this. Before I jump into book 1, could you just give us a very, in a few words, just sketch a bird's eye perspective of what this book is about as a whole?
Well, I'm glad that you said that we were going to try to do justice to this text, because that is what this text is about. It starts with the question of what is justice. After a few attempts to answer that, the question is kind of reframed from what is justice to what value does justice have in our lives? Should we still try to pursue justice even if we don't get social rewards, if no one knows that we're a good person? From there, Socrates says to answer that question, we're going to need to look at justice in as big a form as we can find it. He suggests that's the city. So if we're going to look at justice in the city, we need to find a just city. And the rest of the dialogue becomes this question of what the ideal city, the city with justice in, is going to look like. And that's where it gets its name from. The Republic, Greek politeia, it's about the kind of constitution in which we're going to find this justice. Obviously, it's a very long book, and it's a long book because it goes on a number of really interesting and important digressions from there. We get digressions on the goal of education and the famous expulsion of the poets from the city. We get told what kind of rulers should be in charge of our ideal city, and the controversial claim there is that it should be philosophers. Who would have thought a philosopher would suggest that? We have information about what it is these rulers need to know, and indeed what knowledge is. And that's where we get things like the divided line, which is a famous image that we'll talk about when we get there. And we also get a digression, a really important digression, into the nature of the human soul and the claims that it's immortal and that it's divided into 3 different parts. So that's the tripartite soul. So that's a really quick overview. Is there anything that you'd like to add to that, Jag?
Yeah, I think that was a great overview. I would just add 2 very brief points. One is that we also get these wonderful stories and allegories like the cave and the ring of power that influenced Tolkien later. And then the other point is that the Greek word in question that you rendered as justice is dikaiosune, and justice is certainly the best translation we have available, but that Greek word is broader, which leads some scholars to translate it as morality. And so just keep in mind that it's somewhere between justice and what we would think of as morality. Is that fair?
Absolutely. And did you want to add any historical context before we dive into the details of the text itself?
Yeah, I think we need to do that. And I'll blend it in with the literary context. So if you just open up the Republic to page 1 and start reading, it appears to be a personal account narrated by Socrates, who is relating a conversation that happened on the previous evening. The entire Republic is this long conversation between Socrates and 6 other people at a larger gathering about justice. But it's important to realize that this is not a work by Socrates. This is by Plato, who's Socrates' student, who's writing about 25 years after Socrates' death. All scholars today agree that this is not a transcript of an actual conversation that took place. None of Plato's readers would have thought that. They knew that imagined conversations featuring the wise men of the past was an established literary genre. Of course, many of the ideas put forth by the character Socrates in the Republic are ideas of the historical Socrates, but Plato also uses his protagonist as a mouthpiece for his own new ideas. And scholars spend their whole careers debating, how much of this is Socrates, how much of this is Plato. We're not going to get there. But what I want to emphasize is how much creative control we can see Plato wielding in setting up this dialogue. And here's where the historical context comes in. He imagines this, or he presents this conversation as having taken place some 50 years before the time of his writing, back when Athens was much more powerful and rich than it was in his own day. And we have this conversation about justice between Socrates and other real historical people, at least 2 of whom we, the readers, know would later be killed in the turbulent years that accompanied the downfall of Athenian power and hegemony. So it's kind of like if I were to, publish a book now claiming to preserve a conversation between like JFK and Martin Luther King in 1962, and they're idealistically talking about justice, but of course the reader knows that they're both going to be dead soon. And if I'm a skilled writer, I can create this spooky tension between their idealized visions of the future and what dire fate actually awaits them. So do you see that as well?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. We have this really interesting sort of double vision we need to keep in mind when dealing with this text of the dramatic date, which is earlier, and the actual written date. Very different political periods. One, there's still kind of like hope, I suppose, about what political change could mean and could do. And the second in which we see kind of the drastic impact of political choices upon these characters.
And I guess we should say a few things about why Plato would present a work of philosophy in a dialogue form. Some quick thoughts of mine are that he doesn't think that a straightforward book saying, here's what I believe and here's why I believe it has any real educational value. He's very skeptical about the value of books. He thinks that the way you actually learn is by engaging, challenging each other. And so I think he's simulating the kind of conversation that he wants you, the reader, to learn how to engage in order to pursue knowledge.
We should also say probably that Greek dialogues are weird for us as modern readers. We don't usually use this genre. But this dialogue is also weird in the context of other Platonic dialogues. Usually, the people that Socrates is talking to drive the conversation. They're the ones that kind of present their views, and Socrates challenges those and argues against them. In this dialogue, Socrates is the real driver. He's the one who presents possible solutions to things and drives the argument. So it's still dialogic, but as it continues, the conversational back and forth is actually less overt than it is in a lot of Plato's other works.
That's a great point, and that's why scholars tend to think that in the Republic we are seeing more of Plato's own views put into the mouth of Socrates than in earlier dialogues where Socrates is just the questioner. And another point I would add is that, as you mentioned, this book is infuriating to a lot of readers, myself included, the first time I read it. And it's because almost every page of this book challenges traditional thinking, common sense. So it's like a workout to get through this book. Every page is like slapping you in the face, making paradoxical claims. And I think there's a danger that we have to navigate, which is when you're going to summarize very quickly a book where each argument is so outrageous. I hope we're not going to present like a caricature. And I would just tell our viewers that if you hear something that sounds totally crazy, don't just dismiss it immediately. It might be wrong, but just keep in mind that these are very challenging arguments that Plato is dramatically elucidating through this dialogue format.
And that's part of the point. A lot of these things are going to feel really paradoxical, meaning that they go against common sense or commonly held beliefs. But when you dive down into them, there's a kernel of something which, if you don't necessarily end up agreeing with, at least causes you to challenge your own beliefs and start really analyzing whether the views that you've come into this conversation with are really the views you want to leave the conversation with. And so I would say if there's one thing that we could ask any viewers and listeners to do is to, when they find something which seems weird but sort of interesting, to go to the text itself and see what Plato's own words are and what they can get out of reading it. So with that sort of pitch, shall we dive into our summary of the text? So yes. Jack, that would be over to you for book one. Good luck.
Okay, so book one starts, there's this party happening after a festival. Socrates is there. A lot of famous Athenian intellectuals and socialites are there. As we mentioned, two of them, including Socrates, are later going to be killed by the troubles associated with the downfall of Athenian hegemony. And they get into this discussion of justice. And Socrates, of course, drives this into a debate about the definition of justice. He says, you guys all use this word. What does it actually mean? And we get various proposals. The first one is this concept of giving to each what they deserve, which is still the first sentence in the Wikipedia article on justice today. It's still a fundamental part of how we think of justice. This is first phrased as speaking the truth and paying back your debts. And Socrates is like, well, what if telling the truth leads to some disaster? Or what if you owe a knife that you borrowed to a friend, but that friend is drunk? Do you give it back? There's many easy ways to poke holes in that. Somebody then amends that to giving to each what is appropriate, and that doesn't work because you're introducing a new concept that requires further definition, and people disagree on what's appropriate. Then we get the idea that, well, justice is benefiting your friends and harming your enemies, and that, I think, to us is laughably bad. But I think there's a reason why that's presented, which is that it later gets amended to, well, benefiting friends who are truly good people and harming enemies who are truly bad people. And I think the setup there, I think Plato is inviting us to consider whether notions of justice that involve punishing the wicked and rewarding the good are really tainted by personal bias. And if you really are honest, they often boil down to who is my friend and who is my enemy, whether politically or socially. And then finally, we get the proposal by the famous sophist Thrasymachus, one of people's favorite characters in all of Plato's works. And he gives a kind of Nietzschean or Foucault-type definition of justice as a construct by the powerful in order to justify and solidify their rule and make people think that they're being just when in fact they're just serving the interests of the strongest in their society. Socrates refutes that, and the first book ends in the classic aporia, the Greek word for the state of puzzlement, when people are like, well, what do we do now? We don't know anything. And so people think that book one was originally written as a standalone dialogue because it has that classic format of a series of definitions all being debunked by the classic Socrates questioner.
Fantastic. So you mentioned that this is the part of the dialogue where it looks most like the earlier Socratic dialogues written by Plato. And that includes things like characterization, which kind of, as we continue, drops out. Who are the characters who are talking in this first book? And what do you think the reader is supposed to think about them, in particular when Thrasymachus drops in and blows up the dinner party at the end?
The three most important characters in the first book are Polemarchus, who is the person who invited everybody to this party. He's a young promising, immigrant to Athens from Syracuse, but well-established. And he's one of the people that's going to be killed later in the factional strife and the tyrannical regime that follows the downfall of Athens. And he's the one that puts forth this idea that justice is benefiting your friends and harming your enemies, which is the biggest irony because he's going to die because other people consider him their enemy. Before that, we get his father, Cephalus, the old man of the house, who is nearing the end of his life, and Socrates, asks him how he feels, and he's the one that says, I feel okay because I've led a just life, and so I have nothing to fear from the afterlife. And that's going to be resumed at the very end of the entire Republic, this idea that one of the benefits of justice, of being moral, is that when you pass on to the grave, you're not terrified by what punishments might await you. And then the third character is Thrasymachus, who is this formidable force to be reckoned with of rhetoric and, sophistry. Now, Socrates refutes his Machiavellian conception of justice and maintains that he thinks justice really is a good thing, not just a construct, but something real and beneficial to all who practice it. And that's going to be the main thesis of this entire work, that it's always better to practice justice than to be unjust. Even if you think that doing an immoral act will bring great personal benefit to yourself, there's a mistake somewhere in your reasoning. Because in the end, even if you're never caught, you will end up miserable, as will be argued in Book 9. So Socrates floats this idea now, but he does not yet offer a substantive argument in favor of it.
Great. So now let's move on to book number 2, where this question of justice is picked up again, but is reframed. So the two speakers that Socrates is going to engage with in book 2 and for the rest of the book are Adeimantus and Glaucon, brothers of the author Plato, interestingly. And Glaucon raises the challenge that Socrates, if he's going to defend justice as a good thing, needs to show why it's valuable in its own right, as well as for its consequences. And he says that the common view is that justice is only valuable for its consequences. And it's even kind of worse than that. The consequences aren't of being just, they're of appearing to be just. If other people think that we're a good person, they trust us, we get lots of social approval, we're invited to parties, that kind of thing. And to make this point, he invokes this story, a made-up story to illustrate his point of the Ring of Gyges, which is, imagine that you are given a ring, like the ring in Lord of the Rings, that if you twist something in the setting, makes you invisible. When you're invisible, you can do whatever you want without anyone knowing. So you can be as unjust as you like, but you don't get any of the usual social punishment of people thinking that you're a bad person. Gyges, this Lydian shepherd, who apparently is the first person to find the ring, as soon as he gets it, he starts committing evil acts. He seduces the wife of the king. He takes over the kingdom. He gets everything he wants and leads what seems to be a better life because he's able to be unjust without getting any of the social disapproval that usually comes with being unjust. And Glaucon says anyone given this ring would do the same because there's no value in being just in and of itself without people knowing that you're just and so treating you like a better person. And Socrates responds to this by saying, well, I think that we really need to get a better idea of what justice is before we can tell whether it's going to be valuable in and of itself rather than just for its consequences. We're clearly having a difficult time finding this. Maybe it's because we're looking in something that's too small, the individual person. How about we look in something bigger? What's bigger and also can be just or unjust? A city. So this is the point at which he decides that we're going to try to found in words, so just kind of hypothetically found, a good city, a city in which we're going to have justice. And he's going to call that Kallipolis, meaning the good city or the beautiful city. So when it comes to founding his ideal city, Socrates is going to establish a number of foundational principles, the first of which is that we're going to need to have the specialization of labor. Each person is going to do the thing that they're best suited for, and they're going to only do that thing, whether that be farming crops or building a house. Eventually, as our city gets bigger, we're going to need to take other people's territory in order to support them. That means that we're going to need to go to war, and this principle of specialization of labor is also going to apply to soldiers. So we're going to need to find the people who are best at protecting the city. We're going to call those guardians because they guard the city, and we're going to have them only protecting the city. And this is the point at which we start talking about this new kind of class in the city, people who only protect and guard the city. And Socrates says the most important thing to do with them is to think about how we're going to best educate them. So that is book 2. Any questions about that? Maybe we should just move straight into book 3, honestly, because it just picks that up.
Yes, I think we should. Okay, so picking up from the Guardians you mentioned, book 3 begins with a continuation of this world building, city building. And when you have a very powerful guardian class in a society, the question inevitably arises, well, who is going to guard the guardians? How do you prevent them from abusing their power? And the suggested answer is that a good education is the most important thing. So Socrates and co. discuss the particularly childhood education, because that's when the human soul is most malleable. So they discuss at first what stories children should hear. And Socrates says any story that encourages bad behavior has to be banned, because we need the most perfectly just city we can imagine. So these guardians have to be absolutely perfect. Anything that encourages bad behavior is banned. So any story that describes the gods as cruel or petty has to be banned, because, if the gods can behave this way, why can't I behave that way? Anything that depicts death as a terrible thing has to be banned, because these guardians have to be courageous and not fear death. And also depictions of people disrespecting important sources of authority should be banned. And this then transitions into a critique or attack on the dominant entertainment form of the day, which was the theater. All ancient Athenians loved to watch plays in the theater. But Socrates says, no, not only do these stories on the stage depict all those things we just mentioned, but the actors themselves, in imitating or representing shameful acts or emotional acts, they're going to be inevitably corrupted in their soul by that. The key term here is mimesis or mimesis in Greek, and the argument is that it is impossible for a human to imitate or represent a base action without that getting absorbed into the soul. So the theater will be banned from the ideal state. The ideal state cannot have actors, let alone stories about such things. And then we get a discussion of gymnastics, because Socrates argues that the two guiding educational principles of children are physical education, which makes them tough, and poetry, music, which makes them gentle. And the guardians have to be like guard dogs. They have to be tough against threats, foreign threats, and gentle against their fellow citizens. And we end the book with the famous, what's called often a noble lie, although I prefer the translation noble myth, which is this kind of story that all children in this city will be taught, which is that they are all born from the earth, so they're all brothers and sisters, and their souls contain metals in them: gold, silver, bronze, and iron. Those who are fit to rule have mainly gold in their souls. Those who are fit to be guardians, to defend the state, have mainly silver. And those who are fit to be craftsmen or farmers have bronze or iron. And importantly, this is not a hereditary thing necessarily. Each child will be tested and evaluated to see what they're most suited for. And that's the end of book 3.
Fantastic. So I love book 3, so I have sort of 3 other points to add to that. The first concerning the noble myth, this story that they're going to be told at the end. Importantly, it's also going to break down all family relations. So the idea is that we are going to be sprung into being not from biological families or social families. Instead, we're all part of one big city, which is going to take the place of the family. And that's going to become really important later in the book, particularly when we talk about how to educate children. Also, this, I want to say lie instead of myth, because this picks right up on a distinction that was made in book 2. So just before this story is introduced, that the stories that we tell our young children in educating them to be the best people for the city don't need to be true. Lying to them is fine as long as they're useful lies, as long as they're lies that develop their character in such a way that they're going to be better for the city. So it really is presented as something that we all know isn't true, but still has this important socially cohesive and also keeping you in your own place function. And then the sort of final thing that I wanted to say about mimesis is, again...
Can I just reply to... So
yeah.
2 quick points about those things. So this sounds very unpalatable to modern ears, but let me just quote Neil Gaiman, who said, you know, we don't write stories about dragons because dragons exist, but because they can be defeated. So there's a essentially equivalent formulation, but in a way that we can relate to. And then the second point is that the reason I like noble myth is that a common reaction is like, oh my God, Plato's saying we should lie to our children. And I think what he's inviting you to consider is whether every society has foundation myths, which are essentially lies. And I think they do. I think every single society that's ever existed relies on a few core myths, which are obviously fictional, but they are, as you said, useful.
Absolutely. So I think that this is not unusual in the kind of stories that we tell ourselves about who we are and how we belong to the society in which we find ourselves. But it's still, and this is part of like why it's so important to read The Republic. It's being kind of deliberately controversial by saying this is a lie. If you were in a Greek city-state, everyone might suspect that the myths don't tell the whole truth, but we still go through the motions of sort of pretending together that we were founded by Theseus or that Athena gave us the olive tree. So this is really laying bare how we produce a kind of social control in our children, really sort of openly rather than hiding it in these myths of how we begin.
So mimesis.
Yep. So on the subject of mimesis, yes, the emphasis here is on the problems caused when we start to imitate those people who are overly emotional, those people who lament when they should be courageous. But in this book of the Republic, mimesis is also shown to have a positive educational benefit. If you start imitating the actions of those who are courageous, that's going to instill courage into your own soul. So it's got this corrupting possibility, but also particularly when used in early childhood education, there's also this potential to, in fact, mold kids correctly to make them better people.
Yeah. No, I think that's a fantastic point. And perhaps if Plato were writing today, he would say something like, you know, Homo sapiens is by nature an imitative species, something which, as a parent, I see every day. And the kinds of things you imitate are crucially going to affect how you grow up, I think. So should we move on to book 4?
Absolutely. Right. So book 4 takes on this idea that was mentioned in the myth of the metals or the noble myth, that there are 3 different classes of people correlating to the different kinds of metal in their soul. Those who have gold in their soul are going to be the rulers, but the claim is because they have gold in their souls, they're not going to need to own any wealth themselves. Instead, and this is incredibly controversial, the rulers of our city are going to own no property. So they're going to be the poorest among the inhabitants of our ideal city. Adamantus, one of the interlocutors, the people debating with Socrates, immediately is like, whoa, 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 whoa. These people are ruling the city, but you want to give them no wealth? This is the people who are ruling the city are the people who are supposed to be the happiest, aren't they? And here Socrates makes a really important political theory point that no, actually, when we're designing the ideal city, we're not trying to make any one part the happiest. We're not trying to make our rulers as happy or as wealthy as possible. We're trying to make the best city. And in fact, we can see all around us that wealth is corrupting. So if we want our rulers to be the best possible, to do the best they can for the city, we're going to want to remove all wealth from them. And so I think that's an incredibly sort of important point in terms of contemporary world as well. The idea that the best rulers are going to be those without any money seems very at odds to how most of us arrange our own societies. So after that, Socrates says, we founded our ideal city. Now we need to see where justice is in this city. And he does it by a process of elimination. He says if we've made the best city, it's going to have all of the virtues, meaning all of the features that make it morally good, within it. That's going to be wisdom, moderation, courage, and justice. He goes through eliminating these first 3 by showing where we can see courage, moderation, and wisdom in the city, and says that what we're left with then has to be justice. And it's going to turn out that justice, the thing we're left with, is every part of the city doing its own work. So the ruling being left to those who are naturally suited for ruling, the fighting for those who are naturally suited to fighting, and the production of the things we need for life, our food, our clothing, to those who are best at that. Now we need to move back from justice in the city to justice in the individual soul to make sure that we've really identified justice. And Socrates says, well, bingo, we've done it. This same structure that we saw was justice in the city, everything doing its own work, also works in the human soul. There are in fact 3 parts of the human soul: the rational bit that should do all the ruling, all the thinking, the honor-loving bit that should make you courageous and strive for honors, and the appetitive part, which is responsible for making sure that you have the necessities for life. It gets you to eat, it gets you to drink, it gets you to have sex. And yes, the just person is going to be the one where each of these parts does what it should. And this theory has the benefit of explaining another psychological conundrum. How is it that sometimes we have different desires that seem to compete internally? How can I both want to stay up and watch the next episode of a Netflix show and also go to bed? Well, that's because you've got different parts of your soul within you. All of those can desire different things, and sometimes those desires can be in conflict.
Wonderful. And I think just, to recap a few of the key points so that I can take it on to book 5. So justice turns out to be, again, if we were going to update this to modern language, we might say Plato thinks it is the state of a complex system in which each component does very well, specifically the task it was naturally suited to do. And about the virtues, one thing that irritated me the first time I read this was this idea that if you locate wisdom, courage and temperance, then the virtue left over is justice. And that was like, well, that makes no sense. Like, there could be all kinds of other virtues. But the key point here that I later learned is that the ones you mentioned are the four cardinal virtues. And the reason why they're cardinal is that if you have all of those four, you have all the virtues. So anything else you can think of, like generosity or politeness, all of those are included if you have those four. And so if, again, I'm not saying this is true, but if you assume that for the sake of argument, then it does follow that the virtue left over once you've found three is the fourth one. And then the final point I'll say is that this theory of the soul, the tripartite theory that has three parts, is very similar actually to Freud's division of the id, the ego, the superego. Freud read Plato, was greatly influenced by Plato. And in one of my episodes on The Republic, which actually is on YouTube, I'll put a link here, John Vervaeke, who was a cognitive scientist, claimed that this view of the soul as having three parts is a view that has been rediscovered throughout history. He happens to think it is a good model, and that Freud and Plato are just two instances of the many iterations of this theory. So,
excellent. I would also add to this cardinal virtue discussion something that I have always found difficult about it, which is wisdom and courage. They seem pretty clear what they are intuitively. Moderation, or you called it temperance, even the terminology is difficult in English. It's not one that we talk about nowadays, and the way that Plato defines it is so close to justice that it almost feels like there should really be three cardinal virtues. So moderation is going to turn out to be all of the parts of the city agreeing who's in charge. So that's going to be the soldiers and the people who are doing the production agreeing that it's the true guardians, those with gold in their soul, who should be in charge. Whereas justice is going to be every part doing its own work and not meddling in everyone else's affairs. So that would be the guardians also not making food, or the people in charge of making shoes not doing the fighting. They're very similar. They're both about kind of structural harmony, just kind of described in different ways.
I do have a thought about this because I've also struggled with this for many, many years. And I've talked to a lot of professors and colleagues about this. And my current thinking is that it's easy to imagine scenarios where there is moderation or temperance and there's not justice. For example, in the city, if the producer class has been demoralized and tamed into submission, and the military class has been brainwashed into doing their own thing, they could still agree on who's in charge without really doing what they should be doing, because they should be flourishing in their own capacity. Likewise, if as a human, if you're like in prison in a gulag and you've been starved so much that you no longer desire to have feasts and sex and go gambling and everything, like the appetitive part of your soul does not challenge the ruling part, that's not justice, because the appetitive and spirited part of your soul are agreeing to reason being in charge through a state of deprivation. And so what justice adds is that the three components actually are vigorous, and they are doing things and they're being productive, and yet they still work together. Does that sound fair?
That's incredibly helpful. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, well, glad to be of some service. So let's move on to book 5. And I'm regretting taking on the odd numbers here, because 5 is probably the most controversial book in the whole work that really irritates people today. And it consists of 3 controversial claims. And Socrates warns his interlocutors, that these are going to be like 3 waves, kind of like tsunamis on the beach, 3 waves that are going to, come out of nowhere and attempt to drown you. And he's anticipating that each of these 3 claims he's going to make is going to get people angry. And when the third one is discussed, someone says, that's the kind of idea that's going to make the people grab their pitchforks and go after you, Socrates. So the first wave is that men and women are to have equal roles in the guardian class. They're going to have the same education, the same training, and both going to have the opportunity to be rulers. The second wave is something that was previewed in the noble myth passage, as you mentioned, and that is the abolition of the family and of private property. So the guardians are going, they're children of the earth. They are not going to know who their parents are. They're going to be raised in common. They're not going to have any private property. And there's going to be a kind of state-sponsored mating lottery that will decide who gets to mate with who to have the most suitable children. And those children, of course, are not going to know who their parents are. And then the third wave, the one that is going to get people to grab their pitchforks and attack Socrates, is the claim that philosophers should actually rule the city. And I just want to read that passage. This is 473C to D in all editions. And Socrates says, "Until philosophers rule as kings in cities, or those who are now called kings and leading men genuinely and adequately philosophize, that is, until political power and philosophy entirely coincide, cities will have no rest from evils, nor, I think, will the human race." So that is the third wave that ends Book 5.
Fantastic. So, Jack, tell me more about these mating lotteries, because they're also going to be based on a useful lie.
Right. So this is the part that really upsets modern readers, because it's effectively a kind of eugenics program. And the rulers of the state will see who among the guardian class are the most excellent, the bravest, the most virtuous, and they will arrange for those people, both men and women, to mate to have the most excellent children. And the people who are of inferior virtue will be told, "Oh, you didn't win the lottery this time, so no sex for you, but, good luck next time." So the the guardians will think that this is random, but actually it's not random. There are puppet masters in the background deciding who gets to mate with who.
Just as a follow-up point, this book goes into a lot of the administration of this mating lottery. Part of the problem is that because you don't know who your parents are, you need to treat everyone who's of the right kind of age as your parent, which is great for this kind of breaking down of the nuclear family and treating everyone in the state as if they have the same kind of importance to you as your parents. But it does mean that there is sort of a potential for accidental incest if you don't know who your actual family members are. So this seems to be a really large role of our guardians to make sure that people who could be parents don't mate with children, and people who could be brothers and sisters also don't mate with each other.
And this is, just to clarify, this is for the guardians only. Presumably the farmers and artisans, they can have, most of the society, the productive class, they can still have normal families. But these people who are entrusted with so much power, they have to make these two huge sacrifices to give up all property and wealth and to give up the family. And I think the historical context here is that when Plato looked back on the fall of the Athenian hegemony and the collapse of so many other Greek city-states into factional strife and civil war, I think he saw that there were two common threads that were always present. One was these dynasties, even in democracies, right? Like Athens had 2 or 3 families that just kept getting their children into the highest positions for generations. Kind of like, the Roosevelts, the Clintons, the Bushes, we've had that too, but not nearly to that extent. And the second thread that went through that is that the powerful became too wealthy. And so you want to be a ruler? Okay, you get all this power, but you have to completely give up wealth. Kind of like the Jedi in Star Wars, right? Like they have supreme power, but they have a ridiculously austere, or they should have an austere lifestyle. And then the third point I wanted to mention is that when Plato says that philosophers should rule, he is not at all speaking of the kinds of people that we think of as philosophers today. People wearing tweed jackets and spending their lives in the library. Plato has, or Socrates here, introduces a very radical take of what a philosopher is. A philosopher is almost like a superhero. He's somebody, he or she is somebody who is brave in war, of great mental and physical strength, trained in music, trained in poetry, right? So the philosopher ruler is envisioned as someone who has attained the highest human excellence.
Absolutely. And that is where he picks up the beginning of Book 6. So the beginning of Book 6 reiterates the idea that this third wave, the one that's going to get people to sharpen your pitchforks, is really important for the city. The philosophers are going to have to be put in charge. And it's partly because they are these superhumans. They have this unique ability to clearly see the truth, and they have an unerring knowledge of what's good for the city, rather than just an inconsistent belief. They're also going to love learning, hate falsehood, not be led astray by the pleasures of the body. They're going to be graceful because of all their wonderful gymnastic training. They're not going to be cowardly because they understand the virtues. They're just going to be these fantastic people to put in charge. Here, Adamantus, one of the interlocutors, stops Socrates and is like, I've met philosophers. What you are describing here is not a philosopher. As he says, those people we call philosophers don't do any of this good stuff for the state. They seem to be useless. And worse than that, some of them actually seem to be bad. They seem to make the state worse. Socrates says that they're bad because of the education system. These people who are naturally the most excellent, they're the most quick to learn. So they just soak up anything which is around them. And if what they're soaking up are the wrong kind of values, then they're going to be selfish and care about themselves or the acquisition of wealth rather than caring about the city. Those that seem to be useless, it's because we don't listen to them. He gives this image of a terrible bunch of sailors mutinying and taking over a ship because they don't understand that the captain knows astronomy to be able to navigate by the stars, knows geography to know about all the waves, knows the technical aspects of how to run a ship. They think that anyone can do it. They take over and they run the ship aground. That's what we've been doing. We don't realize what it is that philosophers know and what they can contribute to the state, so we don't let them take charge. And of course, in those circumstances, they're going to seem useless. So after that full-throated support of philosophers being king, Socrates then goes into a discussion of what exactly it is these philosophers know that makes them so much better than everyone else at governing the state. And it's going to be because they dedicate their lives to learning, in particular, the form of the good. And this is opening a whole kettle of fish because what's a form? What's the good? And the end of the book is devoted to this new theory of the forms. The idea is that while there are lots of things in the world that are good, there's got to be something, the relation of which to this thing informs why the good things are good. This thing from which good things get their goodness is the form of the good. And it's somewhere out there in the intelligible realm rather than the perceptible, visible realm. And the job of the philosopher kings is to understand this form of the good. Socrates is aware that this is all very abstract. So he uses an analogy of the sun. The form of the good is like the sun, which not only allows us to see things, but also brings things to life. The form of the good is also not just the thing that allows us to see the goodness in other things, but also by virtue of which those things are good. And then he introduces the divided line, which is an image that allows us to see the difference between things in the perceptible realm and things in the intelligible realm, and that explains why it is that it's harder to see the intelligible realm than it is the perceptible realm. I'm sure, Jack, that you have clarificatory questions about that, as generations of readers of Plato have had before you.
Well, now I'm thinking that you got the hardest book of the Republic. But yeah, this is, I mean, maybe just say a few things about what is the intelligible realm.
Mm-hmm. So, we can think about abstract things like triangles. That seems like when we think about an abstract idea of a triangle, there's an object somewhere out there that we're thinking about. That object, the idea of a triangle, is nowhere in the physical world around us. So Plato says that's an intelligible object. It's an object that exists in the world that we can think about, but that we can't see or touch. It's on a higher level. The forms too, once we can cognitively reach the forms, we really understand things like triangularness, goodness.
So just as your eyes see the physical world, your mind can see, if you will, things like triangles or the Pythagorean theorem. These are things that, for Plato, are more true than any physical object because they are eternal and unchanging, whereas any physical object is always changing. And the divided line you mentioned, which is this notorious puzzle offered in this book, is supposed to help us imagine how the mind can progress from physical reality to these unchanging, timeless, eternal truths, the most important of which is the form of the good, and only the philosopher who can grasp that form of the good will ever know what the good for humanity is. Is that helpful?
That's beautiful. Very clear.
Should we move on? Or
yes, let's move on.
Book 7 then picks up what you were talking about, the divided line, and offers a more cinematic allegory that describes much the same thing, which is the famous cave analogy. And Socrates says, imagine that the education or the human experience of education is akin to the following image. And he says, imagine there's a cave. It's a long cave with an opening that's far from, the end of the cave. And you have all these prisoners who are chained and watching the far wall of the cave. They can't see behind them where the opening of the cave is. On the wall in front of them are projected kind of a shadow show. Because unbeknownst to them, there are people behind them walking behind a low wall and carrying objects over this wall. And behind that wall, there's a fire, the light of which is projecting the shadows of those objects onto the wall at the far end of the cave. So all these prisoners, and we're meant to think of ourselves as these prisoners, they are seeing shadows of objects. The crucial point here is that these prisoners have grown up in this state of bondage. They have never been allowed to turn their heads and see what's behind them. They have no idea that there are things projecting these shadows onto the wall. They don't even realize that they're shadows because their entire perceptible realm growing up has consisted of these images. So for them, that's the real world. They have no reason to believe that there is another realm of things that are more real and more true than what they're used to. Now, of course, this is an analogy for how most people at first refuse to believe Plato, that there are non-physical things like forms which are more real than the physical objects we perceive with our senses. Now, the philosopher's journey is to break the shackles, to turn around, and at first it's going to be painful. You're going to see the bright light of the fire. It's going to hurt your eyes, and for that reason, the actual objects that are casting the shadows are at first going to appear more blurry than the crisp shadows on the wall. So you might think, no, this can't be right. The shadows must be more real than these things. But if you persevere and start making your way out of the cave, your eyes will adjust at which point you're going to realize that there are these people creating these shadows. So those are like the knowledge makers or the opinion makers of our society. And you could join them and, become a sophist like Thrasymachus, or you can keep going. And if you get out of the cave, there you're going to see the actual objects of the real world, of which all of those objects inside the cave were representations of. So you're going to see a real deer and not just a little toy deer that somebody held in front of the fire projecting onto the wall. And you're going to see a real tree and not just like a little model tree that somebody projected onto the wall. So the point is that the experience of the philosopher ascending to behold the forms and the form of the good is like that of a prisoner who is emerging from the cave to see the real world for the first time. And the task of the philosopher is to then go back into the cave and try to free his or her fellow bondsmen and pull them out to enlightenment as well.
Fantastic. And I think this is just it's such a powerful image of the value of learning and truth. The idea that we've all been trapped in this dark cave, seeing only images rather than reality. And then suddenly we have the freedom of being able to escape and seeing things as they really are. It sharpens one of the other sort of concerns in this part of the Republic, which is, well, if the philosophers are having this amazing time contemplating the world of the forms, why would they want to get involved in governance at all? And it's because in our education system, we've trained them to be socially minded, to be civically minded. They're not going to just go out and have a lovely time in the light and the fresh air by themselves if everyone else is still trapped, shackled in this cave in the dark, seeing only these pale imitations. So it really shows that the philosopher has this power to free everyone and make society better rather than just having a good life in their ivory towers.
However, it's a dangerous task because when the philosopher goes back in, he or she has to compete with those image crafters, and the people who are still there, chained and looking at the shadows, are going to say, oh, you've been away a long time. You've clearly gone insane because these are obviously the reality right here in front of us. So that's kind of meant to explain in part why Socrates was killed, because he tried to liberate and enlighten the Athenians, but they couldn't face the truth, and so they killed him. And just the final bit of the book is, well, what kind of education will actually have this effect of pulling people to the light? And it's math, 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 and more math. Only after doing geometry and arithmetic and solid geometry and astronomy should the guardians be finally exposed to philosophy, to ethical debates. And only if they have that mathematical training where they've used their mind's eye to behold non-physical but truly eternal things, can they then employ philosophy to behold the good and then be good rulers. And now we go to book, well, unless you have a comment, let's go to book 8.
So with that, we have concluded the really heavy stuff about the theory of the forms, how we get to know what we know, and we return back to more real-world political theory. So Socrates says, at this point, we've proved that the best city is going to have these philosophers in charge. This kind of city is going to be an aristocracy, which means the rule of the best people. But if we really want to see the value of justice in this city, we should take a quick look at the worse kinds of constitution. And because we care about the individual as well, we'll see if there are individuals whose souls are analogous to these worse kinds of cities. And the 4 types of cities that he's going to look at are the honor-loving city. That's a timocracy. It's something like the Spartan constitution, where it's run by people who are really into military honors. An oligarchy, which is run by people who are into the accumulation of useful resources, so necessary wealth. Democracy, which is run by people who are into satisfying unnecessary desires, and as part of this, are completely lawless and just let everyone do whatever they want. And then tyranny, in which the city is dominated by one man who enslaves all of the rest of the city in the satisfaction of his own unnecessary desires. So we have these 4 kinds of city. In each of them, Socrates gives an account of how the best form of constitution devolves or degenerates into the next one, and how they each devolve into each other. But what he's really interested in is how the individual soul maps onto these. Remember that tripartite structure that mapped onto the tripartite structure of the city? How the individual soul can be arranged in such a way that a person can have all of the faults of an oligarchy or a democracy or a tyranny.
Oh, that's beautifully summarized, and that's exactly where Book 9 uses that point to return to the initial challenge of Glaucon that you mentioned in your summary of Book 2, what's often called the immoralist challenge. One of the questions that's been guiding this entire work, which is why is it advantageous to be just? Why not cheat? And in that passage, Glaucon had said, if someone is a perfect, skillful practitioner of injustice, and everybody thinks that they're just, but they're cheating in every possible way, that person can have an amazing life, whereas somebody who is following all rules of morality might be miserable. So Socrates now has the tools to debunk that claim. And he's using what you just said, the city-soul analogy. So in the same way that a tyranny is a miserable regime, because everybody in a tyranny is fearful, paranoid, there's tension, there's conspiracies, the tyrant himself is paranoid of assassination attempts and everything. So too, the tyrant himself, who is the pinnacle of injustice, the perfect practitioner the most successful practitioner of injustice that can be imagined as a tyrant, he has within his soul a tyranny. The worst part of his soul has taken over the whole thing. Reason and courage, spirit have been enslaved, and all of the terrors that exist in a tyrannical regime exist within the soul of the tyrant himself. Even though he might appear to be rich and happy and glamorous and enjoying the time of his life, he's actually miserable. And so that's why the tyrant, the perfect practitioner of injustice, is actually unhappy, whereas the philosopher, who has a well-ordered soul, is going to be free from all those troubles and is actually happier in the final analysis than the tyrant.
And so this means that the challenge that was posed to us way back in Book 2 by Glaucon has now been met. We wanted to know why justice was good for us, not only because of its consequences, but because of its own sake. In Book 9, that's where we find out why it's better to be a just person. Unlike the tyrannical souled man, your soul is in a better state, you're a fully functioning, healthy, happy human being, and who wouldn't want to be that kind of just person?
Well, if that is the answer to Glaucon's immoralist challenge, why not end the Republic after Book 9? Why does Plato give us Book 10?
That is a very good question. And Book 10 is going to be concerned with 2 different topics, both of which are going to flesh out concerns that were raised earlier in the book. The first topic is about mimesis, imitation. And as we discussed earlier, Socrates has already spoken about this when he was talking about the education of the guardians, how to raise people so that they're going to be the most useful for the city. When we get to the beginning of Book 10, he's going to expand this discussion of mimesis to talk about how it should function in society in general. And he's going to say we were right in expelling the poets from our society, not just because their stories can corrupt the souls of the youth, but also because there's something essentially problematic about imitation, artistic imitation in general. And that problem is going to be that imitation is the representation of something which is many removes away from the truth. We've already had this world of the forms set up, so anything in the visible world around us is going to be one step away from that, the ultimate reality. If you then represent it artistically, be that in painting or in poetry, you're producing a representation of a representation, which is moving further away from the truth. And so having these kind of artistic representations at all is going to be problematic for our society because it's pulling people away from the search for the truth that we really want to inculcate into them and instead showing us these sort of pale shadows of the truth. After we've gone through this final discussion of imitation, which picks up the education challenge earlier, we're going to get this final response to Glaucon's original challenge about why we should want justice for itself, which, as we said, the tyrannical soul has already answered, and for its consequences. There's still this concern back from the Ring of Gyges that if the only consequences you get for being just are that everyone thinks you're just and they treat you well if you appear to be just, what happens if you're in a situation where no one knows you're just? An inverse Ring of Gyges, where everything that you do which is good is ignored, is invisible. And this is what's going to be answered in a story that we get at the very end of Book 10, which is called often the myth of It's a story that we think was written by Plato in order to illustrate the rewards that we get after death for being just. And this story is told by a man called who has fallen to it looks like fatal wound on the battlefield, been effectively dead for long enough to experience what goes on posthumously, only to be revived and be able to bring this tale of the afterlife back to his fellows. He tells us that if you're unjust, after death you will have to pay for each unjust act 10 times over. And conversely, if you're just, you're going to be rewarded for this in the afterlife. So this is why the consequences of being just are going to really matter. It's the reward that we get after death that's going to show us that we need to act justly in this life.
Okay, so we have these two sections, mimesis and then the myth of air. E-R, by the way, is how you spell it, not A-I-R, common mistake. And it's interesting, in any class you take on this, there's always the question, like, why does Plato revisit mimesis in Book 10 if it's already been treated in Book 3? And I think that you explained how now the focus is really on knowledge and the forms. And one kind of succinct summary that later philosophers came up with is that nature imitates the forms, or what we think of as nature, the physical world, imitates the unchanging, eternal truths that are the forms, and human art imitates nature. So, as you said, it's twice removed from reality, and also you kind of lose beauty each time. So nature is more beautiful than art, and the forms themselves are more beautiful than the physical world. I'm just laying that out there as something that I don't think anybody, upon first hearing it, will agree to it, but it's the kind of thing that you can let ruminate in your brain for like years and years, and you might start to see some truth to it.
And if you disagree with this imitation argument, because it brings with it this need to kind of agree with the theory of the forms, Socrates adds some other arguments about why we might not want to have dramatic performances, theatrical representations of things in our state. And that's that they appeal to the emotional parts of your soul rather than the rational parts of your soul. And these, he thinks, are the bits that we're trying to get under control. So he says this about tragedy. It makes you pity too much. But he also says it about comedy or even erotic art. Our kind of impulses towards titillating sex are things that we're supposed to be getting a grip on using the rational part of our souls if we really want to be correctly psychologically set up people. And poetry, theatre, he thinks gets in the way of that.
Yeah. And so in book 3, we didn't yet have the psychological theory that we have now. And so another reason to revisit, as you just said, is that armed with this new tripartite understanding of the soul, you can see a different argument for why entertainment, like the theater or movies nowadays, is something that Plato is very concerned with. There's also an interesting part of the myth of error that we didn't get to yet, which is this idea of reincarnation and how Air, this guy who died, saw the afterlife, came back to report a bit of it. Socrates has him, in his death experience, see famous characters from Homer being reincarnated. So like Agamemnon and Odysseus and others are being reincarnated. What's that all about, and how does that wrap up the entire Republic?
So what apparently sees is a bunch of lives. So think of them as kind of like outlines of how someone's life is going to go, scattered all over the ground. And heroes such as Agamemnon, Ajax, Orpheus, Odysseus get to root around in here and choose what life they're going to have in their next life after they're reincarnated. He says that the first people who are able to choose go for the lives of tyrants. They're drawn in by wealth and power, but when they examine the lives more carefully, they see that actually the tyrant's life is going to be characterized by unhappiness. They're going to be overthrown by their children. They're going to end up without any of those worldly goods. So that picks up the discussion of the tyrant's life in Book 9, in which it was revealed that even if these external things don't happen to a tyrant, because a tyrant's soul is necessarily unbalanced, they're constantly plagued by these insatiable, unnecessary desires, they're never going to have a truly happy life. For the other Homeric heroes, we see how their character faults, the fact that they weren't moral in the Homeric stories, also means that they choose bad lives. They choose lives like Orpheus chooses being a swan, Agamemnon chooses being an eagle, Ajax chooses a lion, animal lives where the rational parts of their soul can't fully flourish. So they're not going to be able to have this kind of like morality that characterizes a good human life. Only Odysseus gets it right. And he's the model for not just the reward after death that we get for really learning about justice, which is that we can choose this good life, but the reward that we get in life. Because he chooses the life of a private citizen, of a good man, his life is going to be unaffected by hardship. He's the only one who gets to be happy. So here we see how, when you consider kind of life as a whole, again, it's going to be the person who is just, the person who makes those moral choices, who ends up having the best life. And after this description of reincarnation, Socrates steps back and concludes again that we've reached the end of our journey, and he's shown us how if we work really hard, strive towards justice, put in the time to learn and make ourselves moral people, we're going to have rewards not just in this life, but in life after death. And with reincarnation in future lives.
Wow. Even though I don't necessarily believe that, I got a bit of some goosebumps listening to you wrap that up. So an inspiring end, a lot of food for thought, a lot of food for mental wrestling with these ideas. Gina, thank you for being a fellow traveler on this journey of exploring Plato's Republic. I couldn't have done this without you, so really appreciate you coming on.
And Jack, as ever, I have learnt a lot from talking to you, which is exactly what this kind of dialogue, like a Platonic dialogue, is supposed to produce in us. Thank you so much for having me, and good luck with the final 3 episodes.
Thanks a lot. If you ever behold the form of the good, give me a call and tell me about it, okay?
I absolutely will.
All right. Take care. Thanks.